Genre definitions change over time. Maybe it's not very dramatic or important, but as more bands push the boundaries of what they're doing, or more outsiders start looking at it with outside perspectives, said boundaries of any term are invariably going to move around a little bit. This isn't a bad thing. I remember a time when Evoken wasn't considered a funeral doom band, and I think loosening the boundaries a bit was a big part of why the 2000s boom was so strong. I bring this up because war metal has been undergoing quite an interesting one over the last decade, to the point that actually finding something with the appearance of war metal that is actually playing proper war metal can be a bit of a surprise. To give some credit to fans of this stuff, as a whole the metal scene hasn't started calling this war metal outright. I quite like the idea of calling it bestial death metal as a play on war metal's cooler pseudonym, bestial black metal, so it's not as much a change to the definition as a new dominant competitor in the niche that it serves. It's definitely still a subset of death metal, but it's taken a lot of war metal's identity and bolted it onto its frame. And as it's grown, it's taken over the same role in the wider metal sphere. I guess you could call it a great replacement. No, don't call it that. I'm not actually a massive war metal guy. I don't dislike it or anything, but it's so minimalist and primitive at the core that I struggle to get too excited by it much, despite enjoying the spiky, goaty aesthetics and prevalent violence. So this video isn't really a complaint about what's happening, I just want to talk about it happening at all. War metal has always been a fairly vaguely defined term, which somehow led to a very narrow sound. It's a lot like the old "I know it when I see it" quote about porn. In basic terms, it's a mix of black metal, thrash metal, death metal, and grindcore, generally all in their early 90s periods at the absolute latest. There's quite a vague collection of many different things that can mean any number of sounds, but somehow it led to an opposite effect where it means quite a specific melding of all those styles. It's almost like a genre term formed through the process of elimination. Too thrashy to be called black death, but of course it's not just black thrash either. Sure, they like the spikes too, but it's more death metal than that. But no, it's not just first wave death metal either, because it's more rigidly structured and more vibe driven than that. Explaining the precise ratios and why it doesn't fit into all the other similarly existing boxes is a pain in the ass, so he collectively just gave up and called it war metal. Fundamentally, it's blasphemy worship, but given blasphemy themselves predated second wave black metal, that aspect of the blend was much lower at first. However, at this time there weren't really many imitators yet, and by the time they showed up, so had Norsecore, so the following acts featured a lot more of that kind of overt grinding black metal in the makeup. On a personal level, my views on this are definitely coloured by it being the mid-2000s when I started getting into this stuff. But given black thrash at the time was a really big deal, the genre ratio had definitely swung to fully represent that. It's black, thrash, death, grind to me, specifically in that order. Given the alternate name as the even cooler bestial black metal, I don't think I'm alone in this one. Basically, it's anything between Conqueror and Blasphemophagia. That's not to say there weren't always more death metal ones out there. Archgate famously have been an outright death metal band for the majority of their existence, and have been pretty much grandfathered in most of the time. Bands like Sadistic Execution also filled the same role as this new stuff, being weird, raw, and rigid pure death metal with overwhelming vocals. But for the first 20 years of the style, it tended to fit in more as a black metal subgenre than any others. The process of this development leads back almost entirely to death metal. In the late 2000s, death metal had the retro old school explosion, and it exploded in a lot more directions than you may have expected given how homogenized the image of the revival can be. There was the sweet earthy stuff, there were death clones, there was caverncore, there was fin deathy spooky oddness, there were immolation knockoffs, but most importantly for this topic, there was a wave of extremely fast, blasty, murky stuff. Bands like Dead Congregation, Ignovomus, Vorum, Adversarial, and Cemetery Urn all played very gritty and murky death metal, but at extremely high speeds and with infinitely more blasting than in the old days. This stuff was still firmly death metal, but it stood out from the pure pastiche stuff by featuring a new approach to raw aggression and noisiness. This little niche served as the launching point for this current movement. Titan Blood stand out as the big name to really put their stamp on it early, particularly on their 2014 album, Death. They're not the absolute earliest member of this group to be overtly compared to war metal, but chronologically they were the closest to it becoming a really well-stocked scene. Mitochondrion definitely got it a lot, particularly on their debut, but there's such a big gap between that and the sound becoming so commonplace that it's hard to really call them a flashpoint. Pseudoguide got it a bit as well, but not as often, and it was sonically even further away aside from the image. Wrathplayer is another plausible option in 2012, but I think that's actually a bit too real war metal to be an origin point. So yeah, I'm giving the credit to Titan Blood. War metal is exceptionally difficult music to get into, and it is very violent, but the challenge of the genre is largely due to the primitive nature of the playing and the single-mindedness of the approach. Conqueror aren't the heaviest, fastest, noisiest, or most intense band of all time, but the album is 45 minutes of one thing, and it does not move from that. It's more of an endurance test than anything else, and while Titan Blood certainly also believe in the idea of sticking with one idea for way, way longer than it makes sense to, there's a lot more colour in the approach and generally more beef in the actual mass of the music. Their brand of extremely regimented, churning death metal with staggered endless blasts and loosely connected rambling vocals, detailed with scratchy, noisy lead guitars, gave it a decidedly war metal feel despite it not really musically being in line with the genre's typical mechanics. And that's kind of the secret of this whole thing. The death metal core gives it more direct immediacy to counteract the minimalism. This more or less laid out the structural template for what was to come. Death metal riffs and vocals, impenetrable production, relentless blasting, and a focus on textural highlights via noise suches and a rhythmic vocal mania. It took a couple of years for this idea to spread around that much, but when it did, it took off in an impressively market-cornering manner. Pissgrave launched in the same year as Death and took an even more death metal angle, doing faster incantation riffs but now with heinous vocal manipulation and noise detailing. It was definitely death metal, but it absolutely gave the vibe of something like Revenge, but in a manner far more accessible to the larger death metal community. They made the wise yet unwise decision to sign with Profound Law, a label sitting somewhere between the underground and art house spheres of metal. As such, they got exposed to a huge audience of people who would never be caught dead listening to stuff with such overt and abhorrent gore imagery. They weren't held back to the gore grind and brutal death fandoms they would have accessed in any other plane of reality. This allowed them to be the biggest hit you could ever imagine for something that looks like, well, like that. Jesus Christ. Obviously, the flip side of this is that said brutal death and gore grind communities now had a reason to look down on them for being, big air quotes here, major label sellout baby music for babies. It's pretty unfair if you ask me. This shit is hard as fuck, but you can't have everything, you know? The last one of this early group of bands I want to highlight is Tetragrammaticide. While it eventually go fully into this by their 2023 album, their importance in the early days was shifting the focus away from the extreme minimalism in regards to musical aspects. In the earlier days they were more musically blackened, but they set themselves apart by leaning into harsh noise as a fun pairing for all the Black Death, resulting in something more textural and in a way, artistic, despite them being more destructive and unlistenable than usual. With these three bands making a name for themselves with fresh sounds and being very large successes for bands that are this extreme, the stage was set for an explosion that we started to see after this. From around 2017 or 18 onwards there was a heap of this stuff. Infernal Coil's ultramuddy long-form deathgrind used the Profound Law hack again to introduce the concept of suffocating miasma at 280 beats per minute to thousands of Pallbearer fans. I'm not exactly sure what Black Curse did to blow up as big as they did beyond just being really good. I mean, it's got the Blood Incantation guys, but so does the much smaller Nature Geist, and that has the free marketing of going dicks out for Satan. Massive Retaliation changed the art dynamic from black with red highlights to red with black highlights, and also incorporated a heap of big bolt thrower grooves into the chaos for an uncharacteristically dynamic and danceable experience. Antichrist Stage Machine is probably the first one to get noticed by being much easier music, with a cleaner, more refined sound and a focus on actually having highlightable feature riffs. A novel idea for raw, churning, wall of noise Black Death. Sticking to the topic of sieges, Siege Column actually held on to a lot more thrash than this other new stuff, but the fact that it'd still be considered part of this movement despite being much more retro-minded should show how dominant it was becoming. By the end of 2020, Concrete Winds were on their path of scene dominance, and even bands that were playing metalcore 5 years earlier like Of Feather and Bone had jumped on the trend. This had become a big wave and it hasn't slowed down since. As of now, this pocket in extreme metal is basically dominated by this. In the last few years, we've had the extra releases from a lot of the big names of the initial explosion, like Tetragrammaticide, Black Curse, Concrete Winds, Titan Blood, ASM, Siege Column, and I guess even Pissgrave, despite their last couple being way less nuts and good. But they're also joined by a whole wave of new bands too. There's been a burst in the death grind and moshy punk side with acts like Primitive Warfare, Vermin Womb, Filth Chasm, and Coffin Nail. Hell, if you want to be extra stretchy, you could also include the entirely grind stuff like Gravesend, Neltrote, and Caustic Wound. I wouldn't myself, but I'm not your mum. As for that new angle on the second rounds of the first wave, there's also a lot more bands doing it in general. Omega Vortex are basically what I wish Concrete Wind sounded like. Vomitrod are like a Swedish piss grave. Sulphuric Hatred utilise a lot of slower parts for this type of thing. Cabinet do a kind of sludgy, impetuous ritual type of atmospheric miasma. Chahom? I don't know how to say that one. At any rate, they fuse it with a bunch of genre-hopping cutesy stuff. This next duo of bands I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce the names of, but they push the noise aspects of Tetragrammaticide even further. And that's just some of the ones doing little twists on it. There's also a heap of bands just sticking to the template, like Abhorrency, Coscrad, Left Cross, Numa Hagion, and Heresiarch. The biggest thing about all this to me, however, is how it's largely squeezed out the entire core of the genre. The 2000s black thrash scene was way bigger than war metal, but it functioned like a feeder league. There was a direct pathway from being a fan of Destroyer 666 and getting into Blasphemer Go to Christ. But this seems to be something of a dead end, and there isn't a whole lot of real war metal being signal boosted by this. A few legacy acts have kept putting out things of solid quality. I really like the last Diocletian and Revenge albums, and Naked Whipper made a surprise follow-up to an album from 1995 this year. But there's almost a total cutout of traditionally styled stuff from fresh bands getting any attention since the end of the Goat Fucker era stuff like Weirgoat. There's like Profane Order? I guess some bands like the archaic cultist duo of Prehistoric War Cult and Caveman Cult might be big enough to put up some fight against this wave too, and they go one better than Profane Order by not sucking. There's also that one Hayfo band album for the Instagram Zoomers, which is at least black metal rooted, but isn't exactly an advertisement for the old ways. Outside of that though, this face-wearing death metal really seems to be the thing jumping out demanding to be heard. If anything, I think this stuff gives something for the more traditional war styles to rebel against. Back in the day, war metal was the hard-assed, no-fun counter to all the slick and fancy modernity of the turn of the century, but it had lost some vitality as the metal scene generally reset to something more grounded. It didn't go away, but it did get relegated to people who want to laugh about the funny evil goats a little bit. Now it has something to get angry at again, and while they've been a bit buried by the success of this new scene, I do feel like those recent legacy band albums and the cult duo of bands I mentioned earlier are some of the more vital stuff in the genre I've heard of for a while. Either because it's genuinely more pissed off, or these new ones in particular may just be faster due to modern ability creep, or because it has, in an unconventional way, found a path back to being kind of novel against its peers again. It stands out by not trying to stand out like the other ones. Again, this isn't really a judgment for or against this shift. I tend to like this stuff more than actual war metal because I'm a death metal guy, but that's neither here nor there. It's just something curious happening in the extreme metal space, and I want to shine a little light on what I find to be an interesting development. Or at least I hope it is, otherwise you just wasted 12 minutes watching me ramble about it.